Hello students, welcome to Chapter 3, Lesson 4, Michigan here. Today we're learning about the southern colonies. And we talked a little bit about the southern colonies in that the first lesson was about Jamestown and Roanoke and a lot of those places that were originally colonized were in the south, but we're focusing specifically on what colonies are going to become states in those original 13 colonies. So let's start with Virginia and Maryland. So we already learned about Jamestown in the beginning of the Virginia colony. After those first few rough winters, the colony really started to grow. There was a high demand for labor, and you ended up having some of the first slaves come into the New World. We had 20 slaves coming from Virginia aboard a Dutch ship all the way back in 1619. Now we're going to learn a great deal about the role of slaves in America and the eventual ending of slavery when we talk about the Civil War all the way off in marking period 3. Now, not only were slaves from Africa brought in to do labor, but you had prisoners of war from England, criminals, other undesirables sent from England. You also had indentured servants, which are kind of like a slave with a time frame on them. Indentured servants were people from over in Europe, across the pond, that couldn't afford to travel over to the colonies, so they would get that paid for by someone in the colonies in return for their labor for a set number of years, oftentimes 7 years. So that'd be like me moving to Germany, and my travel expenses are paid for, but now I have to work for someone without pay for 7 years to pay that off. The good thing is, though, at the end you have a skill. Let's see. All right, so let's talk about Maryland specifically. Maryland is an interesting story. It was a dream of a guy named Sir George Calvert, who was also known as Lord Baltimore. So Lord Baltimore was a Roman Catholic and wanted a nice place for his fellow Roman Catholics to live. You'll remember that over in England, there's this new church that they have, the new official religion, the Anglican Church, and they didn't treat people that weren't Anglicans very well all the time. So a lot of them came to the New World for that religious freedom, right? And so Lord Baltimore wanted Maryland to be a place where Catholics could worship freely. So King Charles gave Lord Baltimore, Calvert, Sir George Calvert, a swath of land north of Virginia. Unfortunately, Calvert died right after he was given this land, and his son, Cecilius, would oversee the colonization of a new colony called Maryland. Maryland. There he is. He's the new Lord Baltimore. So Cecilius sent his 2 brothers to oversee the colony. He also gave large tracts of land to English aristocrats as well as settlers. Maryland grew, and so did its need for labor. Slaves and indentured servants were sent to the new colony. Fun story. Thomas Penn and the Penns and the Calverts fought over where the Maryland-Pennsylvania border was. They fought over this for years. It wasn't settled until they hired Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon to draw a map of the border. And this border is known as the Mason-Dixon line, which is it's the line that you usually think of when we're talking about the Civil War and slaves escaping to the north. They have to cross the Mason-Dixon line. That's when it was made by, Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon. Now, religion ended up being a source of tension in Maryland. Calvert originally wanted it as a safe place for his fellow Catholics, right? So Maryland initially welcomed all Protestants and Catholics, but to ensure fair treatment for the minority Catholic population, they were still a minority in Maryland, the colony established the Act of Toleration in 1649. This was superseded years later by the establishment of an official state religion in 1692. It was just a Protestant religion. And this ended up forcing the same restrictions on the Roman Catholics that they had left England for in the first place. And I'm sure that George Calvert likely rolled over in his grave. Dropping some memeage here. Okay, Virginia specifically. Maryland had some problems. However, so did their neighbors to the south, Virginia. Virginia was growing rapidly as more settlers came and spread west into Native American lands. The top dog in Virginia, his name was Governor Berkeley, and he had made a deal with the natives. In exchange for a large tract of land, he promised the natives that settlers wouldn't move any further west. He was basically trying to stop wars with the Native Americans, Indian wars. Uh, and there was this young planter living out there on that western side of Virginia who didn't like that deal, and he didn't really like this fancy man, Governor Berkeley, all the way from eastern Virginia, making big decisions that would affect those in western Virginia. There were also incidents of violence and attacks from the Native Americans on that frontier of Virginia, and those people that were mad at Governor Berkeley, like Nathaniel Bacon and those other frontiersmen, would end up having a rebellion led by Nathaniel Bacon. It was called Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon and his army went and they attacked some Native Americans. And then they marched on the capital of Virginia, Jamestown, and burned it to the ground. It actually looked like Nathaniel Bacon was going to take over the whole colony of Virginia when he suddenly caught dysentery and died, which is pretty gross. There's a link here telling you all about dysentery should you like to learn more. Here's Nathaniel Bacon getting things done, burning down Jamestown. Now, the two Carolinas. Let's talk about the two Carolinas. North Carolina, South Carolina. The two Carolinas were originally one Carolina, but not Sweet Carolina. A little musical pun. It all began in 1663 when King Charles gave the new colony to 8 nobles. That set up estates and rented land to settlers. John Locke, who was a famous philosopher, we're going to learn a lot more later, actually wrote a constitution for the Carolina colony. Carolina did end up splitting into 2 distinct colonies, though. You see, North Carolina was settled by many from Virginia, and they grew primarily tobacco and sold tar and timber. They had to use Virginia, however, to send their goods abroad. They didn't really have any good ports, so they shipped it all to Virginia, and then it was sent out overseas. Whereas in South Carolina, they grew rice and indigo. Rice required a great deal of labor, and they brought in many slaves to handle the rice paddies. What is indigo? Indigo is a crop that is used to make blue dye. It was also sort of the plantation-style crop, as was tobacco, and we'll learn later, way later, about cotton. So lots of slave labor in South Carolina handled the rice and the indigo. South Carolina, however, had its own good port and was able to send out its goods. So they were just very economically different, so you ended up having North and South Carolina become their own colonies, and they became royal colonies in 1729. The rice barges. Now let's talk about Georgia real quick. We'll finish up with Georgia. Georgia's its own unique story. It was the last of the established colonies. It was set up by a guy named James Oglethorpe in 1733 as a place for debtors to get a fresh start. We learned that debtors are people that are sent to jail because they owe a lot of money, which is ironic because they can't work when they're in jail to pay off the debt. So it was started as a place for those types of people to get a fresh start. But it didn't go as Oglethorpe planned. A lot of poor people moved to Georgia, but not debtors. They also didn't care much for Oglethorpe's strict rules. Rules like no slavery allowed in Georgia, or no rum. Oglethorpe eventually was kind of forced to give in to the demands of all these people living there in Georgia and allow slavery and rum. But he did end up surrendering authority of that colony of Georgia to the crown, making it a royal colony now controlled by the king. This was 1751. The crown had a specific interest in Georgia because the Spanish owned Florida, and it was sort of a border between that Spanish Florida and the English colonies. So they sort of fortified it to discourage attacks from the Spanish. Where is the rum? All right, hey, that's the meat and potatoes of our lesson. We have a quiz here, nothing crazy, 10 points, a little bit of matching and some multiple choice, a little true-false in there. You have multiple attempts. If you need more, please let me know. Otherwise, hey, that's the end of the lesson today. Let me know if you have any questions, and have a good one.